education quality, green technology, and the economic impact of carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is increasingly used by governments to reduce emissions. One mitigating factor that has received less attention is education quality. In this paper, we use data on industrial emissions and student learning outcomes to study the relationship between cognitive skills and employment in industries that rely less on emissions for production.
So we developed an overlapping generations model with two key features. First, in the aggregate production function, the skills of the labor force affects the share of physical capital in production relative to emissions. This introduces the possibility that physical capital that is greener or less reliant on producing emissions also relies on a more highly skilled workforce. The second feature of our model is that agents choose how much to invest in purchasing skills in the first period and then receive wages based on those skills in the second period. The cost of skills for agents is heterogeneous and depends in part on agents' household wealth. The cost of skills represents the quality of education. In a higher quality education system, agents would be able to acquire more skills given cost, and the household wealth of agents would be less of a determinant in the amount of skills agents require. By estimating this model, we're able to predict how education quality affects the impact of carbon pricing on emissions, output, and wage inequality linked to household wealth. We use data from the OECD's Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, PIAC, merged with the EU's air emissions accounts to understand how the skills of workers associate with emissions per unit of output. We estimated Mensurian type regression models with emissions per output of workers' industries as the dependent variable and found that cognitive skills associated first with lower industrial emissions per output and second with faster reduction in emissions per output in subsequent years. These findings are consistent with industrial technology that is less reliant on emissions, requiring workers with higher skills and human capital more broadly. One implication of this association is that green technology may be skill biased. This means that technological change induced by carbon pricing would rely on an education system that can respond to higher demand for skills. But it also means that this technological change may widen wage inequality, particularly between those from poorer and wealthier households, if education systems are not equitable. So we estimated our overlapping generations model for a number of EU countries using the same data. We also used the OECD PISA data, which measures the skills of 15-year-old students, to parameterize each country's education cost function, including the intergenerational link between household wealth and skills acquisition. To understand the role of education quality, we then predicted how the marginal effects of an increase in a carbon tax differ between the current level of education quality and that of the highest performing EU country as a benchmark. We found that having a higher quality education system resulted in a carbon tax having a stronger effect on reducing emissions, less loss in output, and less increase in wage inequality. We did a similar exercise looking at the implications of changes in countries' education quality between the years 2000 and 2012 as measured in the OECD PISA studies. To give an example, Poland implemented a major education reform in the early 2000s, and the resulting increase in education quality, as measured in PISA, would amount to a savings of 0.25% of GDP per year in our model if a carbon tax were used by Poland to achieve the EU's carbon reduction targets.
Conclusions. Our main findings are that cognitive skills as an indicator of human capital is associated with lower industrial reliance on emissions. Second, the quality of education helps enhance the impacts of carbon pricing by increasing the elasticity of the supply of skills needed to reduce industry's reliance on emissions. The policy implications are that investments in education quality, which can be highly cost-effective, as in the case of Poland, plays a critical role in reducing emissions as an enabler of green technological change.